Okay. Okay. Hello. Um, okay, so we're starting with neuroanatomy, and I forgot to put it in here, but I know the second years are kind of MIA right now, because it's like their board season or they're dedicated. So I just wanted to let you guys know like my little thing about neuro. It's one of my favorite blocks. It is so well taught if you do the Dr. White lectures. He's fantastic. If you guys don't know, he does like boards prep like around the country. Like one of the best neuro boards like resources is one of his that like everyone across the country uses. He like teaches at UPenn, their med school. He's just a really great teacher. So if you are doing him, fantastic. Like you will learn neuro really, really, really well. And it really helped on boards too. Like I really think I was like a neuroscientist when I was taking boards because of like how well I learned it during my first year. Okay, so, but if you're not doing Dr. White, totally fine. I still recommend doing his practice questions because I do know just from being like, on curriculum committee, they will have him write some questions for the exam. Not all of them, but at least some of them. He's got like practice questions like that he sends out, like practice exams. He also has uh, like a like a boards prep book for neuro. It's called Roadmaps. Um, and I'll send you like links to that if you guys want. But he's fantastic. And then you can also do boards and beyond, but just keep it it's very neurophysiology. It's a lot of like, where's the lesion type of questions. So, like, if you have a stroke, where's the stroke? Like, what artery has that stroke? But we'll talk about it. I broke this up in two parts because I didn't want to rush through neuroanatomy. I'm gonna do like cranial nerves and brainstem stuff in like part two whenever we do part two. But today I thought I wanted to just at least do like a basic overview, go into neurocytology a little bit, the homunculus. I didn't put development in here because it was too crammed. And I wanted to do at least a little path, like path in the context of anatomy. And then blood supply, which is huge. Blood supply is huge because that's like, where's the lesion kind of thing. Like, if this artery loses its blood supply, what symptoms is the patient going to have? Because that's what you see clinically, right? So they love to ask about that. And then I think I'm going to keep it going where you guys can do the questions on your own. And then like, a lot of you guys have just been like emailing me if you have questions about the questions, but I try to explain it afterwards. But okay. I think that's everything I wanted to say. All right. The other thing too is neuroanatomy. There's a lot to it. I also took a neuroanatomy class in my PhD program. So there was a whole class on neuroanatomy. So there's a lot to it, but I tried to pull in all like the clinical stuff you're gonna see and like the path that's associated with it that you would see as like first years on your exam. Okay, so I didn't go into like crazy depth. All right, so neuroanatomy, so like the nervous system is the CNS and the PNS. So the CNS is the central nervous system. This is going to be the brain and the spinal cord. I don't talk about the spinal cord at all. I actually think that should be its own thing. So like we're gonna do like the brain, then we're gonna do the brain stem, and then I want to do the spinal cord and like lesions in all of those areas. Those are all super like those are like your clinical questions on your exam. So we're not gonna talk about the spinal cord today. We're going to be mostly focusing on the brain. But when you think of the central nervous system, this is what they're talking about, the brain or the spinal cord. The brain is in the cranial cavity, it's in your head, and then the spinal cord is in the vertebral canal. So that's what like goes along your back. Some terminology, like especially when we're talking about like the brain, sulci and gyri, you're going to see this a lot. And it's kind of annoying because like sulcus means grooves and it's not like G and G, which is annoying, but it's like the sulcus are the parts of like, the brain folds. Those are the grooves. So those are going to be like the divots of, again, when you picture a brain with all the little, divots and whatnot, the sulci are the divots going down, and then the gyri are going to be like the things coming up. So like the folds or the ridges. So you'll see that a lot, like central sulcus, post-central gyrus, things like that. That's what they're just talking about, like these grooves and these sulci, but they can be like little terminology like landmarks that they can just ask you to like identify when you're looking at like a brain. And I'll point them out when we get there. And then the peripheral nervous system, this is going to be the PNS. Something interesting is that the cranial nerves are actually a part of the peripheral nervous system. And I highlighted this because people don't remember that because the cranial nerves are basically like up in your brainstem, which is like all the way up here. Peripheral nervous system, people think, like the spinal nerves, the peripheral nerves, like neuromuscular junctions, like the muscular aspect of the, the nervous system, which like people think of like the extremities, but don't forget cranial nerves are a part of the peripheral nervous system. They're not a part of the brain or the spinal cord technically. But I'm not doing cranial nerves today. We're going to be covering them when we do brainstem anatomy. Because a lot of the time when you have like a brainstem stroke or like a lesion of the brainstem, you get a cranial nerve symptom. And that's how you can kind of like locate where the stroke is occurring. Okay, and then spinal nerves, peripheral nerves. This is kind of like getting into a little bit of like MSK, and then your neuromuscular junction. So anything that isn't brain or spinal cord. But again, like I said, cranial nerves are peripheral. Everyone always gets this confused. So just remember it's peripheral. And the reason that's important is because where something called myelin comes from is going to differ depending on if it's a part of the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. So this is just a brief overview of some of the cells that you can see in like either the CNS or the PNS. So the first type of cell that I want to talk about are called astrocytes. And then I just gave you guys this is like a very brief. I know Dr. White has like an entire lesson on neurocytology. This is just my little quick, like 2 bullet point, like this is what you got to know about these things, in my opinion. So astrocytes, these maintain the blood-brain barrier. And these are really cool. They like physically maintain it. Like they sit at the blood-brain barrier and they are the blood-brain barrier basically. Like they are what's like not allowing certain things to cross to get into the central nervous system. But they also provide metabolic support. So they metabolize things. They allow certain things to get through and others to not get through. And these are neuroectodermal in origin. And when we eventually do like, development, I'll talk about this again, but I did briefly talk about this, I think back in Repro, one of like the development lectures. But this is just where they come from. It's just their origin. Microglia, these are, when we do immuno eventually, there's a type of cell called a macrophage, and macrophages are kind of like the cells in the body that make sure like dead things are eaten up and bacteria is eaten up and everything. So it's like the garbage cleaners kind of like the body. That's what macrophages are. Microglia are the macrophages of the central nervous system. So they just kind of like make sure everything is clean, everything's maintained, and they're mesodermal in origin. Ependymal cells, we'll talk about them today because we're going to be talking about cerebral spinal fluid a little bit and hydrocephalus as like the pathology state. These line all of the ventricles. So there's 4 main ventricles within like the brain, the CNS that we're going to talk about. The ependymal cells line them and they produce cerebral spinal fluid. They're a part of the choroid plexus, which will make sense when we talk about it. And then finally, Schwann cells. So Schwann cells, these are going to be what's producing myelin for the peripheral nervous system. And I'm just realizing I totally forgot to put oligodendrocytes on here. I'm going to do that before I upload this. But oligodendrocytes, those are the cells that are producing myelin for the central nervous system. You definitely need to know that. That will likely be a question. Just knowing that Schwann cells are the myelinators for anything in a part of the peripheral nervous system nerves, and then your oligodendrocytes. I can try and spell it. Oligo, and then dendrocyte. These are the myelinators for the central nervous system. Dendro and then cyte. Okay, we're going to do cursive. Okay. So these are like the main cell types that you're going to come across. And then since I brought up myelin, I wanted to talk about myelin because I know this is kind of like physio, but people always get confused with myelin. And it's really important. And this is like the boring stuff that like it's easier to like hear someone tell you than like attempt to like learn it on your own, if that makes sense. But myelin, as you guys know, it's like an insulator, right? It's like when you get like wires in your house insulated, it's because you want them to basically work faster. Myelin does the same thing. It helps nerves work faster. It's an insulator, so it's going to increase conduction velocity. And again, this is, a physio term, like kind of like physics. The thicker the sheath around the nerve, the faster that like impulse will conduct. So how you can kind of think about this in terms of like action potentials, like deep physio, is that allows an action potential to travel further before it kind of like dies off. Okay, so that's kind of what its main role is. But then you're going to get some sort of questions where it asks you like, what else does it increase? What else does it decrease? So we're going to go through some of those. And I tried to underline all the ones that they classically try to ask about. Like it'll usually be like a question, with the arrows, and it's like, which of the following is true about myelin, and it's like the arrows with capacitance, conduction velocity, whatever. But the other thing that it does is it decreases capacitance. Capacitance is compliance. So compliance is, compliance at this point. We did pulm, we did cardio. So it's going to decrease compliance. So if you think about it, it should make it easier then for, nerves to, conduct their impulses. And how another way that they can say this, which is really odd, is increasing the separation between conducting solutions inside and outside of the axon. And I have pictures to show you what this means, but they're basically trying to show, it's kind of the idea of saltatory conduction. That's just how they're wording it. But I'll show you in a second. And another way that, like, increasing the separation between all these different solutions, another way they can say that is increasing the space constant. Okay. And then since remember that capacitance and resistance are inverse, or like compliance and resistance are opposite. So if we're decreasing compliance, that means resistance is going to go up. So if we're increasing resistance, this is going to increase what's known as the length constant. Okay. And then it's going to decrease time constant because it's faster than not having myelin. Okay, this might just be like one of those things that you guys like memorize for now, but I'll just show you kind of like what they're getting at. It's like if you have an unmyelinated nerve, so again, myelin, it's like this fatty layer that either oligodendrocytes or your Schwann cells put around, like physically put around. Like I think it's like the cells wrap their like own axons around these axons and like allow like that fatty layer to insulate. It's really interesting. But unmyelinated nerves are very, very, very slow because the conduction velocity is very, very, very slow. And it does have to do with like, the sodium channels opening and the potassium channels opening and whatnot, like the difference across the membrane and whatnot. That's what all of like these things are talking about. But you can see with the myelinated nerve, it's very, very fast conduction. It allows for it to go really, really fast. And by the time it like goes to the next, myelinated segment, it's a lot further down than, these little breaks right here. It's a lot further. So those are just kind of like what myelin does. No one really likes learning about myelin. But here's like the summary. So it increases conduction velocity, increases the length constant, decreases the time constant, and it decreases membrane capacitance or compliance. Okay, so this is like my summary of myelin. And how they'll usually ask about this is in the context of neuroanatomy. Like they'll usually ask about, some sort of like peripheral nervous system myelinator. Like they'll ask about like Schwann cells in some way. And then it'll say like, oh, an effect of Schwann cells is XYZ. And it's like one of these things. Or an effect of oligodendrocytes is XYZ. Okay. Oh, sorry, I like didn't have the chat open. I see it now. The ependymal cells, where do they originate from? We will talk about it. We're going to talk about it. They're right around the where the ventricles are. But we'll talk about it when we get to the ventricles. Okay, so parts of the brain. So this is kind of like how, like if you were to take like a cross section of the brain, the capacitance of the nodes increase. So it's actually where did I write it? It's just overall, no, not the nodes. So the capacitance of the myelinated neuron, it decreases. It's going to decrease. What did I write? Increase. Yeah, it goes down. And it's because it's basically it's allowing the nerve to transmit the impulse quicker because of this myelination. So there's going to be just a decrease in capacitance. Does that make sense? It's not the nodes itself. It's the overall, like it's this overall like transmission. It's going to be decreased compared to like an unmyelinated neuron. I don't know if I explained that correctly. Okay, good. Okay, yeah, this is like what myelin does to a nerve compared to an unmyelinated nerve. So these are like relative changes compared to an unmyelinated neuron. Okay, so parts of the brain. So there's different parts of the brain here. So we have what can I see? So we have the cerebral cortex and the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is like the C-shaped structure. And what we're looking at is like if you were to take the brain, like let's say like you look down at the brain and like there's that center like divot, if you just cut it through. So this would be like a sagittal cross section. Remember from like, just orientation. So we made a sagittal cross section through the center of the brain and now we're looking at it like just head on. Okay. So this would be like the front of the brain and this is the back here. Here's the corpus callosum. It's like this white matter tract. We'll talk about that eventually. But the cerebral cortex, this is what we're mostly going to be talking about today is the cerebrum and the blood supply to the cerebrum and whatnot. Then we have down here the diencephalon. So the diencephalon is made up of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Those are going to be like their own sessions. Those have like their own anatomy, their own everything. And then the brainstem. So the brainstem is made up of 3 parts. It's the midbrain, pons, and medulla. So the midbrain is going to be the uppermost part around here. When you get this little like divot coming out, that's your pons. And then the medulla is going to be basically the first part of the brainstem, the last part of the main brainstem right before the spinal cord. Okay, so that's your brainstem. And again, it is, when we talk about cranial nerves, certain cranial nerves are present in the midbrain, some are in the pons, some are in the medulla. So like if you have a stroke of like the pons, if you have a pontine stroke, you're going to see certain cranial nerve effects over others because that's where they're located. And then another part of the brain is the cerebellum. This is all the way in the back. It looks really different from the rest of the brain. And you will probably have to I think Dr. White has his own session on cerebellar anatomy and stuff. We can talk about it. But there are also pathology states associated with not having a cerebellum. But the cerebellum is really important for balance. It gets affected when you drink alcohol. So the alcohol really affects the cerebellum. So that's why people get a little they walk a little, funny when they're drunk. It's because it affects the cerebellum. That's really important for balance. But okay, so we're going to be mostly talking about the cerebral cortex and the aka the cerebrum today. Okay, so orientation and terminology. So again, just basic anatomy stuff. So if this is the brain, the first thing I want to point out is if we are looking at the brain like this, so see how this is going to be the temporal lobe, which I'll talk about in a second, but see how it's pointing to the left? That means we're looking at the left hemisphere of the brain. I know that seems really basic, but you'll be surprised how many times they'll just show you a brain and expect you to be oh, what hemisphere is it? And you're like, oh, is it that easy? So if it's pointing to the left, we're looking at the left hemisphere, meaning the left side of the brain. And this is also important. We're going to talk about this with strokes because certain strokes, if you have a right-sided stroke versus a left-sided stroke, it's going to present differently. So it's just important to know, yes, this is going to be the left side of the brain that we're looking at right here. This is the dominant side of the brain. But here is some terminology. So what kind of makes terminology a little confusing is they talk about terms in 2 orientations. So what I mean by that is they talk about as if there's the brain, right? The cerebrum. They break it up like this. So they break it up dorsal, ventral. So dorsal, remember from just other terminology stuff, that's going to be the back or the top, just like the dorsal fin of a dolphin is on its back. The ventral is going to be the belly. So the underside, the bottom. So they break it up dorsal ventral like that, but then they also break it up dorsal ventral with the spinal cord. And this will become a little bit more important when we go into spinal cord anatomy eventually. They'll talk about dorsal columns or ventral columns. And all they're talking about with dorsal versus ventral is the dorsal columns are in the back, the ventral columns are in the front. But dorsal's very associated with sensory stuff in the spinal cord, and ventral's really associated with motor stuff in the spinal cord. So again, that's why it's important to know that terminology when it comes to the spinal cord. It's going to be a little bit different from dorsal and ventral of just the cerebrum. Okay. So those are the first 2. So dorsal and ventral, there's 2 again one's for the cerebrum, one's for the brainstem and the spinal cord. And then there's these always words. So always superior. So the top of the brain, that's always going to be superior. It doesn't matter if we're looking at the brain from where the spinal cord is. It doesn't matter. It doesn't switch orientation like dorsal ventral. So always superior is going to be up here. Always anterior is going to be where the frontal lobe is, which we'll talk about lobes in a second. And then always posterior is going to be in the back, where the cerebellum is. And then inferior is going to be the bottom. And you can kind of note, sometimes people are well, what's the difference between superior and dorsal? They're really not different when you're looking at dorsal and ventral at the brain. Okay, so if you look at this line, for example, this dorsal ventral line I'm talking about with the brain, dorsal and superior, they're the same thing. Ventral, inferior, same thing, because the dorsal part of the brain is the top or the back, and then the ventral part of the brain is the bottom, the belly, whatever. That's also the inferior part. However, don't get confused because dorsal and ventral for the spinal cord is not the same as superior, inferior. Actually, it lines up more with posterior and anterior. You see that? So it's kind of a little confusing. I Again, remember when we were doing this in class for my PhD class, people were they're not understanding. And I'm like, you just gotta draw it out. Just draw it out. It's fine. But superior, inferior is like dorsal ventral, again, for this the cerebrum, and then dorsal ventral of the spinal cord lines and the brainstem lines up with posterior and anterior. Okay, so ventral is going to mean anterior when you're looking at the spinal cord. Dorsal is going to mean posterior when you're looking at the spinal cord. Okay. Okay. All right. So next, just again, the cerebrum is 2/3 of your total brain mass. This is again looking at a lateral view. We're looking at the left side because this temporal lobe is pointing to the left. And then if we're talking about hemispheres here, I did already kind of talk about hemispheres, but we're looking down at the brain from the top, and you make like a sagittal cut. That's kind of what we were looking at. If we pulled it apart and then looked directly on, that's what we were looking at in this image here. But if you look here, and then this is the left hemisphere on the left side, and then this is going to be the right hemisphere on this side. So this is like the front up here, so the front of the brain, and then the back of the brain is going to be over here, and then left and right, and then all this other stuff like and we'll talk about this a little bit more with like with the blood supply, but the left side of the brain is going to receive afferent fibers, like fibers going to, and then it sends efferent fibers to the right side of the body. And I'm sure I hope you guys have heard this before, like, oh, the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. 100% true. And it's the same thing. The right side of the brain is going to basically control the left side of the body. And that has to do with spinal cord tracts. Again, we're not really talking about like tracts today. That's like, wanted to do basic anatomy today, but that it just has to do with like the tracks like to cross over. A lot of the things in neuro, things like to cross over, and that's an example of it. Okay, so the left side of the brain technically controls the right side of the body. Right side of the brain technically controls the left side of the body. All right, and then the lobes. So there's 4 lobes. They're named for the bones that are on the skull that basically cover it and protect it. So the 4 lobes of the brain, we have the frontal lobe in green. So that's this. Again, we're looking at the left side of the brain because we have the left temporal lobe over here. So we have the frontal lobe here. We're going to have the parietal lobe here in blue, the temporal lobe in yellow, and then the occipital lobe in pink. And each of them do their own things. We're going to learn about, I'm going to kind of teach it in a way of like what's affected during strokes, because again, you learn a lot about the physiology, the anatomy, learning about the path. So if you lose a certain function because a certain, artery is occluded, that's a really good way to learn about what the function of that lobe is, for example. So I'll go into a little bit more detail with this when we go through strokes, but just these are the 4 lobes and where they are. You can see the central sulcus. Remember, the sulcus is like the little groove that goes in, and then that's kind of where it switches from the frontal lobe to the parietal lobe. You have another sulcus called the lateral sulcus. That's going to separate the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobes. And then you have the parieto-occipital sulcus, which separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. Okay, so they're all really nice. They kind of like line up with what they separate, but the lobes of the brain do correlate to the bones of basically what covers them on the skull, because, the brain's in the skull. Okay. This is another view. You're going to see a lot of, when you have to like identify structures in anatomy, they're going to show you this picture a lot. So if you're sitting like just this like kind of like assessment, and if you're sitting here like, I have no idea what I'm looking at here, you are not alone. So this is a really confusing thing. It kind of takes a little bit of time to like learn what you're looking at. This is the ventral aspect of the brain. Okay, so remember my dorsal ventral line of the brain. We're looking basically underneath the brain. So we have a brain in our hands, and then we're going to flip it over, and we're going to look underneath of it. Okay, so hopefully that helps. So this would be like the right frontal lobe here, because again, we flipped it over. This would be the left. I know it's kind of like, it is like anatomy brain, but it's like anatomy brain, but then someone like flipped, so you could look up onto their brain. And then this is also the frontal lobe. And then we have the right-sided temporal lobe here. And then this is the cerebellum. You can't actually see the occipital lobe. That's in pink. But this is the cerebellum here on both sides. And then you also can't really see the parietal lobe. Okay. So I just kind of wanted to show you, because you will see this when we'll talk about the diencephalon stuff eventually, because that's a little bit more of the confusing parts of neuro. You will 100% see this cut out, and they'll have you there'll be like random letters, like identify what A is and whatnot. Okay, but I just wanted you to at least see it from this aspect. All right. And then, so the first thing we're going to talk about is, the cerebrum. So this is going to be your brain lobe. So frontal, temporal, occipital. And the telencephalon is going to be, that's what the so the telencephalon is composed of the frontal, temporal, and occipital lobes. And you can kind of see like, there's a lot of like weird names for all of these things. Like the telencephalon is just made up of these brain lobes. It's like, cool, good to know. The diencephalon is just the name given to the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So it's just like, they just like to combine certain names. I think I had it on the last slide. I didn't really go into it, but yeah, like the midbrain, sometimes they call it the mesencephalon. They're the same thing. The pons, sometimes they call it the metencephalon, and the medulla, they sometimes call the myelencephalon. So you'll just see that, like it just has that association here, but it's still midbrain, pons, medulla, telencephalon, and then diencephalon. Okay, so again, just wanted you to see all of the terminology. Here's diencephalon, we've talked about it, thalamus and hypothalamus. The cerebellum, this is going to be your coordination. So again, like I said, think about the cerebellum gets affected when you're drinking, and that's why people are kind of a little wobbly when they're drinking. But it's also affected, again, in certain pathology states. So a lot of the times when you have an issue with the cerebellum, they say that this is an issue with ataxia, like the patient will present with ataxia, and that just means like they're not stable on their feet. And usually when you see that, you're thinking like maybe this is a cerebellum problem. Not always, but maybe this can be a cerebellum problem. All right, and then kind of we talked about the brainstem. There are 3 parts of it: midbrain, pons, medulla, mesencephalon, metencephalon, myelencephalon. It's going to connect to the spinal cord. We'll do this another day. And then just kind of going back into the divisions of the cerebrum. So I kind of broke it up into the major things here. So the first thing I do when I'm looking at something like this, besides identify what side of what hemisphere I'm looking at. So we're looking at the left hemisphere because again, we can see the left temporal lobe. It's pointing to the left side. The next thing I do is identify the central sulcus. So the central sulcus, like I said, this is going to separate the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, basically. Technically, yes, the occipital lobe, but it separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Directly in front of the central sulcus is the primary motor cortex, okay? The other thing you can see instead of primary motor cortex is pre-central sulcus. Okay, so pre-central sulcus, pre means in front of, so we're in front of the central sulcus. So that's where the motor zone is in the brain, basically. Right behind the central sulcus, this is going to be the major sensory area of the brain, so somatosensory, so sensation, like feeling things and whatnot. Another name for this is your post-central sulcus. Okay, so if you see like they are trying to be slick and don't want to say like the motor area of the brain, they might say pre-central sulcus. Same thing. So the pre-central sulcus, that's your primary motor cortex, your primary motor area. Your post-central sulcus, this is your primary somatosensory cortex. Okay. Your frontal lobe is involved with it is involved with motor function. So I put motor here. Your premotor cortex is here. Your primary motor cortex is here. You have your frontal eye field here, which we'll eventually do when we cover vision. Frontal eye field, it's like motor movements of the eyes in some ways that's motor movement of the eyes. Your prefrontal cortex, this is like kind of like behavior. Like you see like the random case studies. I'm sure if you've ever taken a psych course, you've seen like the random case studies where it's like someone messed up their prefrontal cortex. Now they're like a totally different person. It's because this is like kind of like your personality or behavior. There's a major speech area here, Broca's area, which is right here. So this is speech, and this is spoken speech. So like you're speaking, like actual speaking. And we'll talk about this with one of the strokes. It's usually always affected with a certain type of stroke. They have issues talking. Similarly, go to the sensory area now. It's your parietal lobe. Everything like has to do with like somatosensation is involved in your parietal lobe. And we'll go through a few pathologies, but like even Dr. White will just bring up like these random pathologies, and they're like, oh, like this happens when the parietal lobe is affected. And that's where your main like somatosensory areas are. So your primary somatosensory as well as like the somatosensory association cortex. So that's there, just like we have the primary motor cortex and the premotor cortex. This is just all motor. Temporal lobe, this is like we'll talk about it very briefly. There's like the limbic system is located here. That's like emotions and stuff. It's not as important, honestly, like in my opinion. I think there is Dr. White does have like a unit on it or a lecture on it, but it's not as important in my opinion. That's like more like PhD level, you know, like the rats and like understanding like addictions and stuff. They really like the limbic areas. But what's more important for us is the temporal lobe houses hearing, so your primary auditory cortex. So that's going to be here. This allows you to hear. And then it also houses Wernicke's area. So Wernicke's area, so people usually confuse Broca's and Wernicke's. We're going to go into it a lot more. I'm going to talk about both of these, like, because these are like two pathologies associated with like anatomy. But Wernicke's area is for comprehension of spoken language or just comprehension of words, basically. So it's like Broca's, you have an issue with speaking and like actually getting words out. So you can imagine people are like stuttering, they're like unable, they like can't talk. They're like, why? And they get really frustrated. They're like, why can't I talk? Like, what's going on? Wernicke's, they don't think anything's wrong. They're like, they're having a great time. They're speaking all they want, but they don't know what they're saying makes no sense. And it's because they're not understanding what they're hearing and they're not understanding how to make like actual words that make sense. So people say like Wernicke's is like a word salad because they're just saying random stuff that doesn't make sense. So those are two really big differences between if you have a stroke affecting Broca's area versus a stroke affecting Wernicke's area. They're in two different locations, so usually they're two, like, sometimes it's like two different arteries are affected when you have these different strokes, but sometimes not. Sometimes it's the same artery that's affected. So you kind of have to like read a vignette and like be like, this sounds like Wernicke's area, we're in the temporal lobe, or like, oh, this sounds like Broca's area stroke, we're in the frontal lobe. And then there's something called the arcuate fasciculus, which is right here. This is like a matter tract. I forget if it's white matter or gray matter. It's one of the two matters. It's a tract. I actually think it's white matter. Don't quote me on that. But it's this white matter tract. It connects Broca's to Wernicke's. And that makes sense, right? We want to connect what we're understanding to what we're now going to say back. So they are connected, and there are different types of pathologies where if you affect this, like this arcuate fasciculus, you can't get either. You can't speak and you can't understand what's being said. Okay. And then back here in the occipital lobe, this is going to be your primary visual cortex. So again, you might have heard that, like you see like with the back of your head, because it's like that's where like the primary visual cortex is. It's all the way in the back. And that'll be its own like session. That's also very confusing. All right, but this is like all the important stuff to know. We're not going through this right now, but this is for you guys to kind of like go through and learn. This is all important, but it's not something I personally think you have to sit here and like memorize. You'll see it just like in questions and it'll come up again and again, but it's a good reference just to kind of have. Okay, and then this, like I said, we're not really going into too much detail with like some of the like the thalamus and the the hypothalamus and stuff like that. But another cross section that they can show you on an exam is a coronal cross section. So you can kind of see here, this is like the cross section that they did. They did like a coronal cross section, and then you looked at it head on after they did that. And I tried to color code with like what parts of the brain these are. So for example, like the ventricles. So here's lateral ventricles. These are just empty spaces. We're going to talk about them. These are what's lined with the ependymal cells. You see your two lateral ventricles here and then your third ventricle here. These are ventricles that just contain cerebral spinal fluid. Okay. The orange, these are anything a part of the diencephalon. So right here, your thalamus, hypothalamus, we know that that's a part of the diencephalon. That's what's in orange. So that's going to be here. And then whenever you see like deep structures of the brain, like that's not just like an arbitrary, someone's like, oh, that's really deep in there, so like we're going to call it a deep structure. There's certain things that, neuroanatomists call deep structures of the brain because they don't want to list all of these things out. So that's everything in purple. These are, again, going to be like its own session. These have like its own kind of anatomy, own kind of pathology state associated with them. Parkinson's and Huntington's affect different aspects of these deep structures of the brain. So when you eventually learn about Huntington's and Parkinson's, you're going to be talking about everything in purple. Okay, so some of those are going to be your caudate nucleus and internal capsule. We're actually going to be talking about the internal capsule today a little bit. The lentiform nucleus, which is just made up of something called the putamen and the globus pallidus. And then we have the subthalamic nucleus and then the substantia nigra. So these are just all of your deep deep structures of the brain. Those are going to be like its own thing. And then finally we have anything in blue. This is a part of the limbic system. So your limbic system, like I said, this is going to be like, addiction, emotions, things like that, memory and whatnot. So one of the things is mammillary bodies. Talk about that with like Wernicke-Korsakoff. Wernicke-Korsakoff's going to come up again, like throwback to GI, because the mammillary bodies are affected. This helps you with memory. And then the amygdala and the hippocampus also like memory and like emotional, like understand, like trying to process emotions and whatnot. So that's your limbic system. And then the only other thing on here that was not defined is the insula. So I just defined it. This is a large fissure. So again, just like a little, divot that separates frontal and parietal lobes from the temporal lobe. I don't think they'll ever ask you to identify the insula, but I just wanted to have it on here for you guys, so it's labeled. This is the same thing I kind of showed you. So this is, again, another cross-section. So again, here's kind of this cross-section, and here's another cross-section, but it's kind of showing the same thing. But now we're kind of focusing a little bit more on like where the internal capsule and the basal ganglia are. And then I just kind of like tried to color code again. So what's a part of the basal ganglia versus what's a part of just the internal capsule, orange and green. So the basal ganglia, everything was on the last slide. So like the caudate nucleus is here, the putamen is here. And then down here, where do I have? Yeah, and then like the various parts of like the globus pallidi. So the globus pallidus, externus, internus, this is all basal ganglia. Everything I put a red like slash in. The internal capsule kind of like runs through the basal ganglia. So if I get rid of it, this is the internal capsule. So it goes kind of like this. It's like a wing. It goes like this, and then there's an anterior segment, a genu or like a bend, and then a posterior segment. We will be talking about the internal capsule today, but it's, again, a white matter tract that allows like communication between, as you can see, like different parts of the brain. Like here's the frontal lobe up here, and then over here is like the parietal / temporal lobe. So it does allow for communication. It's kind of just like a tract, again, like I said, it's not really like a structure, it's just like a tract. But there's different aspects. Again, if you were to like damage the anterior part of the internal capsule versus the posterior part, it's going to present a little bit differently. Okay. But I do have over here, like, must be able to identify this. I guarantee you when you get asked, like, when you eventually learn, like, Huntington's and Parkinson's, they will ask you, like, they'll give you a vignette about, like, a Huntington's patient, and then it'll be, like, what part of the brain is affected. And it's, the caudate nucleus or the putamen or something, and they'll have, like, letters going to this. So I just wanted to put this on here again. When you do that and are, like, learning about that stuff, you can come back to this and see it labeled and, like, color-coded. Okay. All right, so now getting into like not as much gross anatomy, now getting into like some other aspects of anatomy. So the ventricles. So ventricles, these are just spaces, and this is where like cerebrospinal fluid is. But cerebrospinal fluid is produced in the ventricles by those ependymal cells, and it's how they actually get moved around the brain. Because again, it's kind of like ventricles are allowing for like padding of the brain, like cerebrospinal fluid. It allows like your brain to kind of have some cushioning. So you want to make sure that it can get to all the ventricles, so it can kind of like cushion the whole brain. And you'll see what I mean by that. And then it goes all the way down to the spinal cord. And I put here, like, any blockage of the ventricles can lead to something called hydrocephalus. And I have a few slides on hydrocephalus because this is one of those pathology states that's associated with anatomy. And the reason and hydrocephalus just means like your head gets really big, like you have a really big head. And the reason, think about that, it's like you have this fluid in your brain that has nowhere to go because it can't like move around. It can't move around in the brain. So it just gets build up, and then the head gets bigger and bigger and bigger. All of the ventricles should communicate with each other. So there's two lateral ventricles, and then they go to the third ventricle, and then they go to the fourth ventricle, and they go to like the spinal cord, and whatever is not kind of used gets drained, and it gets drained actually into like the heart. Actually, it goes to the right ventricle. Goes to the right, the right ventricle of the heart. It goes through like the jugular veins back into the heart. But we'll talk about that. So here is, venous drainage. So I think there's an Anki card on venous drainage. Even if you don't do Anki, like definitely know the order of venous drainage. And I think I have a better picture of this. I have a better picture of this like later. But this is like, these are called dural venous sinuses. And it's just, again, how we drain the arteries that are in the brain and how we drain the brain, for example. And also cerebrospinal fluid can somewhat get drained from these sinuses, but they're called dural venous sinuses because they're within like the dural layer. And I don't think I went into like dural, arachnoid, and then pia matter. But you can kind of see like, no, I actually don't have it on here. But it's like the three like coverings of it's the meninges. It's like it's just like the outside part of the brain. It's covered by three layers: the dural, the dura, the arachnoid, and then the pia. And I think the reason I didn't cover it today is because when you go through like hemorrhages, like a subarachnoid hemorrhage or something like that, that's kind of when like the meningeal anatomy kind of comes up. So I thought it could like get held off a little bit. But regardless, they're called dural venous sinuses because that's where the main like sinus is. It's within like the dural layer. And it gets strained, and then yeah, we'll go through this. But first, how is cerebrospinal fluid formed? And this is kind of like, where do ependymal cells come from? And it's kind of like, so here is your choroid plexus. So everything in blue in this picture, that's a ventricle. So if you look here, it kind of looks like I don't even know what it looks like. It looks like a C. So like here's a ventricle. It's a C, and then it has a tail. So these are your lateral ventricles. And there are lateral ventricles on each side of like each hemisphere of the brain. So again, remember, this is a cross section, like a sagittal cross section. So we're just looking directly into it. So it only looks like there's one, but there are two. I think actually this image, no, this one. So see how when we do like a coronal cross section, here's one lateral ventricle, here's the second one. So there are two, but if we're looking at it, from the other way, from this way, it's going to look like there's only one because they're like stacked on top of each other, if that makes sense. So there are two. This is not high enough, so you can't see it. But here it looks like there's only one. So here is one of the lateral ventricles, and then you have your third ventricle. So they're going to flow into the third ventricle, and then from the third ventricle, they're going to go to the fourth ventricle, and they're going to go down to the spinal cord. But what lines all the ventricles is called choroid plexus. So this is choroid plexus, and if we kind of zoom in on choroid plexus, which is what I tried to do here, we're going to have the choroid plexus is primarily made up of these ependymal cells. So that's kind of where they're coming from, is they're coming from this choroid plexus. They're just like embryologically, they're derived from choroid plexus. And if you see here, here's going to be, I don't have here, but some of the things that these ependymal cells do is they make cerebrospinal fluid, but then they also excrete waste and whatnot. Like they basically filter, they allow for like filtration. And again, this is really important in the blood-brain barrier to be able to do this, because you don't want everything going into the brain that comes into the body. And you always hear that, like, certain drugs can cross the blood-brain barrier, so they're going to go to the head a lot faster than like drugs that can't cross the blood-brain barrier and whatnot. And it has a lot to do with these ependymal cells that are lining these ventricles. Okay. So here's another like must know this order, the order of CSF flow. This is what they'll ask. And the reason they'll ask this is because of hydrocephalus. And I'll show you kind of like how they ask these questions. But for example, here are the lateral ventricles. So they're going to start there. So these choroid plexus that's here, this is making CSF. So CSF is made here, and they're going to be made in the, so that's in pink, and then it's going to be made, and then the cerebrospinal fluid is in green. So it's going to kind of go and cushion where the lateral ventricles are. Then it's going to go through like a hole. And again, I say hole because it's a foramen. And again, remember like the foramen ovale and like the heart, it's just like a small opening, a hole. So it goes from the lateral ventricles through this small hole called the foramen of Monro. Okay, it's not labeled on here, but that's what it does. So from lateral ventricles to the third ventricle, it crosses through the foramen of Monro. Now it's in the third ventricle, which is this guy here. So this guy, once it's in the third ventricle, it's great, but now it needs to go to the fourth ventricle. But if you notice here, look how small this opening is from like where the third ventricle is in to get to the fourth ventricle, which is down here. That's called the cerebral aqueduct. This you'll 100% talk about. You'll 100% talk about the cerebral aqueduct, because this is a very common like childhood pathology state, is that the cerebral aqueduct gets blocked, and that's like the number one cause of hydrocephalus in children. But we'll talk about it when we get to hydrocephalus in a few slides. Good question. So does the third ventricle have choroid plexus? No. So very good question. That's also like another like little, anatomy fun fact that they sometimes ask. Really only the lateral ventricles and the fourth ventricle have choroid plexus. For some reason, the third ventricle does not have choroid plexus. It's probably like an embryology like thing, like over time, like maybe it had it and then it lost it. But no, the third ventricle does not have choroid plexus. Okay, so lateral ventricles, foramen of Monroe. Now we're in the third ventricle. Third ventricle goes through the cerebral aqueduct, which again, really, really tiny, really, really thin. And now we're in the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle, there's also a choroid plexus here. So yeah, there is some cerebral, like new cerebral spinal fluid being made here, but it's not a big deal because everything's being filtered. And then from here, it passes through two foramen. One is called the foramen of Magendie, and one is called the foramen of Luschka, or foramina Luschka. All of these can be like foramen of or foramina. Yeah, I don't know. Clearly, like someone just they wanted to name things after themselves. But remember, they might. I don't think they'll really like these aren't like as important, honestly. But like sometimes they'll have them in like multiple choice with like the foramen of Monroe and like the cerebral aqueduct, and you're like, oh no, what are these things? Like, where are these guys? But these are later. These are going to be down after the fourth ventricle. Like when it's trying now, the cerebral spinal fluid is trying to leave the fourth ventricle. That's where you're going to be encountering Magendie and Luschka, those foramen. Okay, and then they do go down here to the spinal cord. They are insulating well, not insulating, but like cushioning the spinal cord as well, because again, these do the entire CNS. But you'll notice here, it also does a little swerve, and it also goes through where the subarachnoid space is. So it's going to be underneath like the arachnoid matter part of the meninges that I didn't really talk about. But it's going to go just through here into like it's again, we're trying to still just like cushion aspects of the brain, so it goes through the subarachnoid space, which again is just underneath the arachnoid matter, and it's going to get absorbed by arachnoid granulation. So again, we're cushioning, it's great, we're cushioning, and then it can get absorbed through what's known as arachnoid granulations, which I think I have a better slide to show you what those look like. But they're just little arachnoid granulations are just like little areas where now it can like diffuse through, basically. So once it goes through those arachnoid granulations, now we're in the venous system, the dural venous sinus system. So we're going through, and now we're going to go through the venous sinuses, and now we're draining. So as you can see, some of the cerebrospinal fluid is circulating around the brain. It's going down to the spinal cord, but again, it can't just sit there and build up in the brain. It needs to get drained. It needs to leave. So it's going to go through that venous sinus system, which is draining just the normal arteries of the brain as it is. It kind of joins with that, and then it goes into the heart. It's actually really similar to like lymphatic drainage. So like lymphatic drainage, when you did a lymphatic system, yeah, the veins are draining the arteries, but then kind of like the lymphatic system and the venous system kind of come together by like, where I don't even remember, like the subclavian angle or whatever, and it goes back into the heart. It's kind of like the same idea. So it kind of joins with the venous system to kind of get drained. Because again, we don't want too much building up. That's how you get hydrocephalus. So the reason that, oh yeah, I did put this here because they're like kind of like how you can think of like these arachnoid granulations or subarachnoid granulations. You might see that. This is kind of like how the brain gets away with not having lymphatics. So there's no lymphatics in the brain. There's no like random lymphatics you have to memorize. But there are kind of like from just random cushioning, it's going to leave through one of these subarachnoid granulations to the venous system, and that's what I'm zooming in on. I'm zooming in on like this process right here. So we're in the subarachnoid space, right? So here, imagine like this is where cerebrospinal fluid is, and then it's eventually going to just go through these subarachnoid granulations, which again, it's just kind of like it allows it to diffuse through. So it's going to kind of diffuse through, and then it goes into this venous system, this like what it looks like, like blue pools, right? Like these like pools, it's like your venous blood. So again, it's coming up, and then it's going to go through a granulation, and then it's going to go into the superior sagittal sinus, and then you have to memorize the order of drainage all the way down to like the jugular vein, which goes back to the heart. And like I said, there's an Anki card for it, or you can just make like cards like just to memorize the order. And the reason I mentioned these subarachnoid granulations, I don't think I talked about it today because I didn't know if I wanted to go into that much detail, but meningitis actually causes like these subarachnoid granulations to get really affected. So meningitis, messes with all the meninges, right? It's meningitis. It's messing with your meninges. But one of the things that it does, because it's messing with the meninges, is it kind of takes out these subarachnoid granulations, which you're like, okay, cool. But what that means is a symptom of meningitis, therefore, can be hydrocephalus, because now we're not allowing drainage into we're not allowing the cerebrospinal fluid to leave kind of the subarachnoid space and enter the venous system to get drained. So again, it's kind of like a weird symptom of meningitis, but if you see that with with a patient that has like those classic signs of meningitis, like the neck stiffness, the fogginess, all that stuff. And they also said like, oh, there's hydrocephalus, be like, okay, yeah, that's probably meningitis. Does hydrocephalus cause heart problems since CSF drains into the heart? It's a really good question. Not that I know of. There are some, heart problems that come because things get there that shouldn't be there. But hydrocephalus, since cerebrospinal fluid is basically, I didn't really, again, go into what cerebrospinal fluid was. I guess I could have, but I was just thinking that's more physio. But it's basically like an ultrafiltrate of your blood. So an ultrafiltrate of your blood, and actually that's kind of what this slide is showing. Here's like your blood, right? Oh, that's red on red. All right, well, we have, blood's coming, and then waste will enter the blood, and then some of the things will leave. This is going to be kind of like your cerebrospinal fluid. It's like this filtrate of your blood. So since cerebrospinal fluid is a filtrate of the blood, even if there's like tons of it going back to the heart can still kind of like deal with it, because it's like, all right, this is blood. It's just like more pure blood, if that makes sense. But it can eventually, like overwork your heart, and you can kind of see some symptoms of like, volume overload in the body. But by that point, like you'll realize like you have hydrocephalus, and like you'll go, and I'll talk about like very briefly like the treatment, how you would treat something like hydrocephalus because of like a blockage of these ventricles. But mostly you won't see heart problems just because it's not going to be that long before you kind of get treatment for it, if that makes sense. But I'd imagine eventually, yeah, because like it is draining back into the heart. So even just like making your heart like tired. But okay, so must memorize this order, yes. So coming out from these subarachnoid granulations into the superior sagittal sinus, now we kind of follow the arrows I drew. So we have the superior sagittal sinus. This is coming from the arachnoid granulations. It's going to kind of meet up. So this isn't really like an order, but it's going to meet up with a few other like sinus tracts. So we have the superior sagittal sinus meeting up with the inferior sagittal sinus, which the inferior sagittal sinus drains into the straight sinus. And then we have these little veins over here called the great cerebral veins. All of these are going to kind of line up, and you can follow the arrows to kind of like make sense of it in your head. They're all going to merge together in what's known as the confluence of sinuses, which just sounds really regal, but it's like that's where just all the sinuses come together. So the superior sagittal, the inferior sagittal, these great cerebrals, and your straight sinuses all go into the confluence of sinuses. And it's just kind of like a bunch of pipes draining into like one area. And then from here, then it's going to be from the confluence of sinuses, it drains to the transverse sinus, then the sigmoid sinus, and then it goes to the internal jugular vein, and then it goes to your right ventricle. Okay, so it's kind of like this is how we're draining not only just like the arteries of the brain, but also the cerebrospinal fluid, because it's able to get basically through this venous system through the superior sagittal sinuses. Okay, cool. Hydrocephalus, so just a few slides on it because it's like path. This is kind of what's happening. So again, looking at the brain, a cross section, a sagittal cross section. Here's your lateral ventricle here. Remember there's two, but it only looks like there's one here. Here's your third ventricle, and then your fourth ventricle is like down here. It's not even, they don't even care about it. And then all the different types of, all the different like foramen. Yes, I'll go through that order again, sorry. So the foramen of Monroe, and then we have the cerebral aqueduct, the cerebral aqueduct, and then it's not shown here, but then we would have like foramina of Luschka and Magendie. And hydrocephalus is anything that's going to cause an increase in any of the ventricles. It's going to literally cause the head to swell. It's just, think of it as like swelling, and it looks really crazy. But I'll show you. There's two different types of hydrocephalus. There's communicating and non-communicating. And just really quickly, before I go into it, kind of like showing this is communicating is, think of it as if nothing is blocking any of these foramen, nothing is blocking any of the aqueducts, nothing's getting blocked, but for some reason there's still tons of cerebrospinal fluid. There's too many. Like there's just too much cerebrospinal fluid. What do you think is like, just even thinking in your head, like what is like one thing that you would think of, like, oh, what would cause more cerebrospinal fluid to be made without being a block? A tumor of your ependymal cells. Yes, very good. Sorry, I beat you to it. A tumor of your, so there is an ependymal cell tumor that one of the symptoms is hydrocephalus. That's an example of communicating hydrocephalus because there's no blockage. We're not breaking communication between any of the ventricles. We're just having more cerebral spinal fluid than the body's capable of like getting rid of. Yes, meningitis, very good. Another cause of communicating hydrocephalus. And again, it's like I said, you can't drain out of the arachnoid granulations. So there's like, it can't drain. It's blocked. So it's gonna, which I know blocked is not the best word there, but you know what I mean? It's like it's unable to leave, but there's no blockage between any of the ventricles. The ventricles are fine, but you're still getting this symptom of hydrocephalus. So I would say like an ependymal cell tumor, I'm definitely not saying that right, or meningitis. Those are like the main two causes of communicating hydrocephalus. Non-communicating is a lot more common. That's what you see in kids, and it's going to be a blockage of one of these guys, one of these foramen. So we'll go into that. But first, I wanted to go through this order one more time. So this again is going to be the venous drainage for just all the arteries in the vein. So again, like in the body, all arteries are drained by veins. But this is also how cerebral spinal fluid gets drained. So for example, the cerebral spinal fluid is going to leave through the arachnoid granulations, subarachnoid granulations, whatever, and it's going to leave through the superior sagittal sinus. And now it's like the order of venous drainage. So what makes this kind of confusing is like the order of venous drainage is, it's like multiple pathways at once. It's like we have like 3 separate pathways leading to one, like, all right, I'll just talk. So up here, this is like your superior sagittal sinus. So like superior sag, all right, superior sagittal sinus. Then we have our inferior sagittal sinus, inferior sag. Okay. And then we have like our great cerebral veins. So great. All right. Or greats. And then these two, so your inferior sagittal sinus and your great cerebral veins are going to drain into the straight sinus here. But this is all happening at the same time as the superior sagittal sinus is also draining. So all of these things are kind of happening like at the same time. So your superior sagittal sinus is draining into the confluence of sinus, which that's where we're going, confluence, at the same time that the inferior sagittal sinus and the great cerebral veins are draining into the straight sinus, and then the straight sinus drains into the confluence of sinus. Confluence of sinuses. Does that make sense? Did I draw this really weirdly? All right, hold on. Let me actually, there's one, so I'm going to get rid of this arrow. There we go. I think that's what we're doing. All right, so inferior sagittal sinus and the great cerebral veins are all draining into the straight sinus at the same time that the superior sagittal sinus is draining to where the confluence of sinuses are. So superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, great cerebral vein draining into the straight sinus, going into the confluence of sinus. And then it's not as confusing, which is nice because then they all follow the same thing. Then we have the transverse sinus, sigmoid sinus, internal jugular vein, right ventricle. There are some other sinuses. I didn't underline them because they're super low yield, but they are here. So superior and inferior petrosal. The petrosal, it's like another name for one of the cranial nerve arteries, which is like a problem for another day. But the superior and inferior petrosal sinuses, again, I really don't think you'll ever get asked about these, but these drain into basically the sigmoid sinus, and then it goes out through the internal jugular. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, sorry. I should have had like a flow chart. It's kind of confusing, see, but I think this is the picture from Anki. So I kind of wanted to like show it how Anki asks about it. But yeah. Okay, question, sorry. Would hypertension and heart failure also cause extra CSF to be produced? It's a really good question. And you're probably thinking because of, like there's just volume overload, right? The brain, which you'll find over these next however many weeks of neuro, like 9 weeks of neuro, however long it is, you'll find that the body, like just evolutionarily, really, really protects the brain, like a lot. So you'll see something like hypertension, things that are happening outside of the brain tend to not affect the brain. So it makes sense, like hypertension, heart failure, like we're getting this volume overloaded state, like doesn't that mean there's going to be more volume in the brain? And actually it doesn't, because again, right here at this, and I think, I feel like Costanzo goes into this a little bit. I didn't do Costanzo my first year. I know it's like, whoa, the first block I didn't do Costanzo. I do think she goes into it. I think I looked into this a little bit during my second year. It's just like all the cells that are at the blood-brain barrier and these ependymal cells and all the cells that are like at the brain don't allow anything. They basically just like don't allow anyone in. They're like, no, extra fluid, can't have it. I feel like there's some Kaplan questions on the drive that go into like increasing intracranial pressure and like, yeah, like what is it? Like ICP, like you'll get some questions about that, but usually they're affected more so by like gas changes. So like CO2 and O2 gets affected. That's going to affect the amount of fluid that's in the brain, which is going to affect the amount of pressure in the brain. I hope that makes sense. But something like heart failure, volume overload in the body, the brain's like really good at being like, no, we're fine. Like I'm not going to take more fluid in, if that makes sense. Again, because of the blood-brain barrier and because of these cells that are lining these ventricles. It'll make sense. Take my word for it. But yeah, if you do see changes in like the intracranial pressure in the brain, it's usually again due to like CO2 changes or O2 changes or like, that ABG kind of stuff. It's like more so because of that versus then just like a volume overloaded state. Actually, the brain usually doesn't get affected. Not saying it can't, but usually it doesn't. Usually you're going to see like increases in intracranial pressure because of other things. And then shockingly enough, there are some diuretics that you can give for increases in intracranial pressure. But again, usually it's not the ones that you're going to give for the heart, like the volume overloaded states and like the kidney diseases and hypertensions. Okay. All right. It's hydrocephalus. So the first one is non-communicating, and we already talked about this, so it's great. You guys already kind of taught yourself. So non-communicating or obstructive hydrocephalus. This is, like I said, there's no communication between one or multiple of these ventricles. So again, some of these foramen are getting blocked. So an example would be we block the foramen of Monroe. That means that the amount of CSF that's in the lateral ventricles is going to increase. Another example is we block the cerebral aqueduct. This is one of the most common ones. That means the amounts of cerebrospinal fluid in the third ventricle and the lateral ventricle goes up because it's everything ahead of it now. And like I said, this is why it's really important to know where all these foramen are, because if they say like, oh, Magendie and Luschka get blocked, all the ventricles are going to get increases in cerebrospinal fluid. So it's just kind of keep in mind where all these are. Oh, which was next. Okay. So foramen of Magendie, foramen of Luschka, one of these guys gets blocked. All three of these ventricles are going, well, technically four because there's two lateral ventricles. So both of the lateral ventricles are going to have increases in CSF. The third ventricle is going to have increased CSF. Fourth ventricle is going to have increased CSF. Here are the most common causes of them. So these, you will talk about all of these. These are all very, like, they're high yields for like pathology for first year. I think Dr. White talks about all of them eventually. But the first one is, hopefully makes sense, cerebral aqueduct stenosis. So stenosis is exactly what it is with like, valvular stenosis in the heart. It's just like a narrowing of. So the cerebral aqueduct is already super narrow. So if you have it even more narrow, that's going to cause an increase in both third ventricle cerebrospinal fluid as well as your lateral ventricles. So the path between third and fourth ventricles becomes blocked. This is super, super common in kids, and it's a congenital defect. So like they're going to be born with this. Chiari2, and like I said, I didn't go into too much depth with all of these because it's just like these are quick snapshots of all of these different types of causes of non-communicating hydrocephalus. Chiari2, there is going to be a whole, I think actually Dr. White goes into this when he talks about cerebellum. He'll go into Chiari2. There's Chiari1 and Chiari2. Chiari2 is the one that causes the hydrocephalus. Chiari1 just like causes like headaches and stuff. It's not as bad. But basically what happens in Chiari malformation is, remember that cerebellum? It like dips under and it basically blocks like flow between the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle, or it can block fourth ventricle out into the, I know it like this picture looks like it's blocking like after the third ventricle, but it can also block above it. It can block below it. That's why I don't even have like what pathway is commonly affected, because it can just block certain, but they would tell you like where like what part of the, what ventricles are affected with this. But usually, like I said here, it commonly results in cerebral aqueduct stenosis because this is a congenital thing. They're born with this. It's basically where the cerebellum like dips into the like where the brainstem area is. It kind of like just like it's too forward. It's too ventral, and it shouldn't be that ventral, so it blocks. You can get hydrocephalus, and then the other one is Dandy Walker. Dandy Walker, which again, it's really funny. If you guys listen to Golian, like Dr. Golian, that that Spotify podcast guy. I love him. He talks about Dandy Walker, and he always talks about how like it sounds like he's like betting on his horse. He's like, oh, my horse is Dandy Walker. I don't know why that's relevant, but he does talk about Dandy Walker, and it's basically where your cerebellum does not form. It's like a big part of the cerebellum. It's called the vermis. It just does not form. So you can see in this picture, this is like a normal X-ray or MRI, whatever this is, not in clinical. This is the normal cerebellum. It's like completely missing in this patient. And you're like, well, why would the cerebellum not being there lead to hydrocephalus? Now the fourth ventricle basically just expands. So this is like, they call it cystic dilation of the fourth ventricle. Now this whole area is fourth ventricle, which is wild. And then this is going to lead to an increase in pressure, and it's going to like eventually lead to blockage. Like no CSF is going to be able to get through because it's just so big now. This fourth ventricle is so big. So it's acting like a block. All right. Less common causes, like I said, ependymoma, and then meningitis. But those are more of like your, communicating or like your communicating hydrocephalus is syphili. I just put them on here as a reminder, but we talked about them. Communicating, nothing's affected. It's just we have more CSF. And then if we have more CSF, again, one of the most common ways is like you're not allowing drainage through the arachnoid granulations, or you're not allowing movement through the subarachnoid space, which is going to subsequently increase. So nothing's getting blocked. There's no X's on this little list here, but you're not basically allowing like proper movement, which is going to cause a buildup. And I didn't put all of them on here, but the one I did put on here is a normal pressure hydrocephalus. This is a type of communicating. So again, we talked about TB, we talked about an ependymoma, just increased amounts of CSF. There's another type, it's a subset of communicating, but it's really confusing because it leads to normal pressure. So they call it NPH, or normal pressure hydrocephalus, because you do technically have hydrocephalus, but it's kind of like you can't tell almost. Like the brain, like the head doesn't look like it's getting bigger, like the ICP, like the intracranial pressure might not be much higher. It just seems like everything's very normal, but it's technically hydrocephalus. And the reason why is there's just going to be more CSF in these patients' brains, but it's because the ventricles get bigger. Okay, so if you look at this picture here, here's like a normal brain, here's one lateral ventricle, here's a second lateral ventricle. In like an older person, there's going to be some like degeneration of like the brain, and that means now the lateral ventricles, for example, can get bigger. So they can get bigger because there's degeneration of like the brain tissue, so they'll get bigger. Now it's kind of like that whole Dandy Walker thing with like the fourth ventricle getting bigger. It's the same thing here. It's like the lateral ventricles are getting bigger. So now it's like it's not flowing as nicely. So it's like technically the pressure in the head is normal, but you can still have technically hydrocephalus, because hydrocephalus, again, is just increased cerebrospinal fluid in the brain. So this is a subset of communicating because, again, nothing's blocked. But if the way you kind of diagnose this is you do like an X-ray or an MRI, and the ventricles are going to be increased in size. And Dr. White does talk about this, and he always, like everyone always mentions, that these patients are wet, wacky, and wobbly. So they, and you can see here, like they have, so wet is for they have incontinence. Wacky, they're gonna have like, they're gonna act like they have like, they're just gonna be acting all weird. And they talk about it here, like they're apathetic, their speech is odd, they're just kind of acting a little weird, and then they're wobbly. This is like they walk with these small steps. They call it like a magnetic gait, or walking on a boat. So a magnetic gait is like, imagine you have magnets on the bottom of your feet, and then you're trying to walk like on a magnet floor. It's like really hard. That's kind of like how he describes a magnetic gait, or walking on a boat. Like you're really kind of like unsure, like when and this is not the same as ataxia. Ataxia is like you're like falling all over the place. Yes, good question. So these symptoms, wet, wacky, and wobbly, these are going to be a result of the neurodegeneration and the hydrocephalus kind of together. And I didn't go into it too much, like, well, why are they incontinent? Why are they wacky, wobbly, whatever? Because it's more so going to be affected by this type of neurodegeneration that you see. And another name for this, if anyone is interested, it's called like hydrocephalus ex vacuo, EXVACO. No, VACUO. There's really no like cause of it. It's just like, yeah, like you're older and then you have like this neurodegeneration that just occurs from being older. So that's kind of like that, and then it leads to hydrocephalus. All of that together is what causes this wet, wacky, and wobbly. It's a good question, but I didn't go into it because again, it's like it's going to be dependent on like the degree of the degree of the neurodegeneration and whatnot. But when you're doing a vignette and you see like these symptoms, you can kind of and then they say like, oh, the ventricles are increased in size on an MRI. You're like, oh, okay, like that's normal pressure hydrocephalus or hydrocephalus ex vacuo. I've seen that too. All right, but your common patient presentation. So this is like any of them. So any communicating, non-communicating. The number one thing that's going to happen is increased intracranial pressure, or ICP. How that's going to present is with headache, nausea, vomiting, papilledema. So like the eyes are going to have like weird stuff on your ophthalmic exam, an abnormal gait, impaired consciousness. So all things that happen from just having too much pressure in your brain. There's something called a Cushing triad. So Cushing triad, I mean, there's tons of triads in medicine, right? But Cushing triad is going to be increased blood pressure, decreased pulse, and decreased respiratory rate. That's Cushing triad. Cushing triad, again, it's not just for hydrocephalus, but anytime you have increased intracranial pressure, likely you'll see Cushing triad, or like you'll see it in like the vitals. Like you'll see increased blood pressure, decreased pulse, decreased respiratory rate. And then the main way to kind of identify it is what's known as the setting sun sign. And it's like if you look at, or like sunset eyes is like another way. So like if this, like imagine this is like a baby's pupil, a child's pupil. It's going to look like you can only see half of it, just like you can see a sun as if the sun is setting. And so like something like this, like you're only going to see half of the pupil. And it's because there's so much pressure in the brain. It's kind of like the brain looks, it's almost like, I think of it as like, like they have to like tilt their head back to kind of like carry all that extra weight. It doesn't have to do with that. You'll learn about different types of gazes when you do like, when you, when you do some, when you, yeah, this baby is, yeah, this should be a meme. This baby has seen some stuff, but just imagine when you see this is your sunsetting. Sometimes they'll say like patient is sunsetting or something like that, and you're like, what the heck does that mean? And they're usually talking about the eyes. You hear that sometimes with like drug overdoses. They'll talk about like sunsetting, but with ICP, they're talking about like that's what they're talking. If it's like a baby, like they're not drug overdose. I hope not, but usually it's going to be like hydrocephalus, and you can look for those sunset eyes. It, again, doesn't have to do, like I said, it's not because they're trying to hold their head up and their eyes are like leaning forward. It has to do with the gaze pathways, which we're not going into gaze pathways today. But you lose a specific type of gaze when you have hydrocephalus. So they can't look up, they can only look down. And that's why. So it's like they can't lift their eyes up. Okay. But yeah, so that's hydrocephalus. And then how you treat it, it's really cool. You treat it with what's known as a VP shunt. So a ventriculoperitoneal shunt. And peritoneal, just like peritoneal from GI. So you basically put this like catheter, basically. It's like this catheter that you put in the ventricle and you drain it down in the peritoneal cavity. It's really cool. And then it just, again, you're just draining out the cerebrospinal fluid and you're just putting it in the peritoneal cavity. It's like, here, you guys kind of handle it. All right, so that's how you treat it. All right, so that was a little path, detour. Back to the brain. But so this is, again, another CNS cross-section. So we did this one already. This is a coronal section. Now you can see the two ventricles. Here's your two lateral ventricles here. The thing I wanted to point out here, and I put it in caps and bolded it and highlighted it because you'll get this, and I don't want you guys to get it wrong. White matter and gray matter. So white matter, anytime you see like, oh, there's white matter, that's where axons are, okay? So axons have white matter, and I don't want anyone to memorize this. I want everyone to be like, axons are myelinated. Myelin is big, white, and fatty, right? It's myelin. It's just fat. It's basically just fat. So just think of it, if there's axons, they must be myelinated. That must be where fat is. So you can already imagine here, when I'm looking at just this brain cross-section, all of the axon tracks are going to be where this white is, because that's where myelin is. all the cell bodies, or like, where here's a cell body, here's an axon, all the cell bodies are going to be where the gray matter is. And like, dendrites, I guess I didn't really go into that. I apologize. But like dendrites are like the receiving part of neurons, like that they're receiving like impulses, they're receiving things. And then the axons are like sending things away. So afferent is going towards the dendrites. Here's your cell body. And then efferent is down towards like going away, and it goes through the axon. And again, that's why myelin's so important. So it allows quick transmission of that nerve impulse. But gray matter basically contains everything that's not axons. So cell bodies, dendrites, very, very proximal, like very proximal parts of axons, things like that. And in this image, in this cross section, everything white, this is white matter. So it's like inner, and then everything gray is outer. This is gray matter. And again, it's just because in the brain, in the brain, not spinal cord. So don't say all of the CNS, just in the brain, the axons are on the inside, the cell bodies, dendrites, all that stuff is on the outside. So the white matter's inner, gray matter's outer. And I'm really emphasizing this because the spinal cord is the exact opposite. Because it just is, because why not? So pay attention to this, because sometimes they'll have you identify, white matter versus gray matter. They'll ask you like, oh, this is a white matter tract or something like that. And kind of what I was doing earlier. And it's like, where's the location of it? So white matter's on the inside, gray matter's on the outside when it comes to the brain. Spinal cord, see how it reverses? So now the white matter is on the outside. And again, we're not doing spinal cord today, but white matter's on the outside, and the gray matter, I know it's purple on here, but the gray matter's on the outside. And then just basic spinal cord anatomy, like I said, dorsal ventral, it's literally like, imagine that line from before, like the first slide. The ventral is going to be in the front, which is going to be down here. So ventral, this is like your motor areas, and then your dorsal is going to be in the back. This is like your somatosensory areas, which again, that'll be like a whole other day. But mostly wanted to point out white matter's on the outside in the spinal cord cross sections, gray matter's on the inside. In the brain cross section, it's opposite. Gray matter's on the outside, and then white matter's on the inside. Yeah, I'm not going to. So this, you'll eventually have to know this. We're not going to do it today. It's just all the different parts of the spinal cord. And again, the idea of it, again, is like, let's say we take this one tract out. What happens? Like, what would you see? Spinal cord syndromes, lesions, things like that. You take out this pathway, what would you see? That's its own session. Okay, but again, same concept kind of thing, gray matter in the middle, and then everything else, all of this out here, this would all be white matter. Okay. The homunculus. All right, so the homunculus is a big anatomy concept. This is a drawn to scale human representation as to what specifically the brain regions are supplying and to what degree. People don't like the homunculus. I love the homunculus. I think it's a great way to help you before we go into like the strokes. Like if you have a stroke of this part of the brain versus a stroke of this part of the brain, like what symptoms will you see? If you know the homunculus, you will never get a question like that wrong. And I will show you why. So the homunculus, again, it's not going to make any sense. I'll show you what it looks like. But it's basically like if you had to put a part of the body and just put it on a brain section and be like, this part of the brain controls this body part, that's what the homunculus is. So it's like, what is it supplying? Like what part of the body is it supplying and to what degree? So if they're drawn bigger, that means it really supplies it. If they're drawn smaller, it means it's like, oh yeah, that part of the brain supplies it like a little bit. Usually this represents the contralateral side. Again, remember, it's that whole thing where it's like the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body and vice versa. So for example, the primary cortex in the right cerebral hemisphere is going to be, and remember primary I think I meant primary motor cortex, sorry. The primary motor cortex in the right cerebral hemisphere leads to motor activity on the left side of the body, okay? And again, this is important for strokes. Very, very, very important. And then there are technically two homunculi. So there's a motor homunculus and a sensory homunculus, but they are the same thing, basically. I have both of them, but they're basically the same drawings. But it's like, this is for motor, this is for sensory. And hopefully you'll see what I mean. All right, so this is the homunculus. Like I said, people don't really like the homunculus because it's weird, but I think it's great. So what it's basically trying to show you is okay, so here is the central sulcus. And they're trying to show you, so somatosensory, like we talked about, that's going to be post-central sulcus. So that's going to be what's in gray. And basically they take it and they just expand it. So these are the various gyri and sulci of this portion that's highlighted in gray. They just kind of like took it and fanned it out. And they're showing like, okay, down here towards like the bottom part, let me erase my, okay. Down here down here closer to like the middle of the brain, I guess, it's going to be more stuff about the, like around the face. So like your eye, your nose, your lips, your tongues, your teeth, things like that. That's going to be really affected by this area of the primary somatosensory cortex. When you get to like the middle of the primary somatosensory cortex, now it's kind of like your hand, your arm, your fingers, things like that. And then closer to the top, like up here, that's going to be like where your legs are and whatnot. And it's really weird. I know it's a really weird picture. Shoulder, head, neck, things like that. That's going to be more so at like the top of the where the somatosensory cortex is. So that's somatosensation. Motor's pretty much exactly the same, but now it's just drawn even more creepier because why not? But you'll see it's like an exact replica of the somatosensory. Again, now we're in the primary or the precentral sulcus, or the primary motor cortex here, precentral. But it's the same thing. Towards the bottom, it's going to be more face, then it's going to be more upper extremity, and then up at the top, it's going to be more lower extremity. Okay? And I'm going to show you, here's like another, again, it's the same thing. They're showing like somatosensory cortex, motor cortex. They do opposite parts of the body. That's why I liked that they showed like the little crossing over. But it's the same thing. The mouth and the face and the creepy stuff of the body are going to be towards the bottom of it. And then as you kind of go closer to like where the central, like the central like sulcus, I don't want to call it like a sulcus, but you know what I mean? Like that central like divot of the brain, which is right here. As you get closer, it's going to be towards like, it's going to go down on the body. So like mouth, then like upper extremity, and then lower extremity. And it's the same for sensory and motor. And I want to show you, I don't remember if I took this out of your guys' PowerPoint, but I don't want you guys to actually do it. I just want to show you like how they would ask a question. Like they will ask about a homunculus. They'll just not say like, this is asking about a homunculus. So basically it's just saying, you know, there's a 71-year-old man. He has sudden onset of slurred speech. He's got drooling. So a lot of issues with like the face. So drooling, issues talking, all sorts of stuff. And it's like, okay, so the patient's presentation is most consistent with an injury to which of the labeled areas of the motor cortex. And if you remember from the homunculus, this is more lower extremity, right? I always remember like legs like hanging off, like they're like dangling their legs into like a pool. And then this is more like upper extremity. So I'm between like A and B. And this is always going to be just like a long shot, like, all right, which one was mouth versus, you know, eyes and stuff. But for this one, it's going to be A. And if you look at the homunculus, mouth is a little bit lower down to the bottom, especially like tongue and whatnot. Like I said, everyone kind of draws the homunculus a little bit differently, but it's always the same kind of premise, if that makes sense. So they can ask about the homunculus. I promise I didn't just put it in here because I like it, but I want to show you like it'll really help you with blood supply. And we'll get through blood supply like that because it's like, oh, that's nice. It's really quick. All right, that's the homunculus. So next, I think we're just going to finish with blood supply. But I'm going to spend the most time with the cerebrum. I'm going to just very, very, very briefly, just for completion. It's like I have like one slide on like brainstem blood supply, but we're doing a whole session on that with the lesions. You're going to get every single brainstem stroke question right. I also have like a foolproof way to never get a brainstem stroke question wrong. Promise. So we'll go through that in like another one. The deep, like those deep structures that we talked about, you know, basal ganglia, stuff like that. And then the cerebellum, just very brief, quick blood supply questions. But for the cerebrum, when I'm talking about blood supply to the cerebrum, I'm talking about like those strokes, like a cerebral stroke. Like if you hear someone had a stroke, usually they're talking about one of 3 arteries that gets lesioned, basically. So to kind of understand that, and like I said, there's 3 main arteries that you should know. Blood supply to the cerebrum is through what's known as the circle of Willis. And I just think it's funny. I always imagine like Bruce Willis, just like being, I don't even know, just like, I don't know. But not he. The circle of Willis is a circle. Duh. This is the circle of Willis right here. It's a circle. It makes like this nice little circle. And there's 3 major arteries that supply the cerebrum that are a part of the circle of Willis. So the first one is called the posterior cerebral artery, so the PCA, which is going to be this one. We have one on the right, we have one on the left. We have the middle cerebral artery, we have one on the right, one on the left. And then we have the anterior cerebral artery, which is up here. One on the left, I think this is left, and then one on the right. And I put a few pictures on here that you guys can kind of go through later to kind of visualize where this, like, where is this? Like, this just to me looks like a human, right? Like, if you just look at it and like, this looks like a toddler with arms and legs. This is on that ventral aspect of the brain that I was showing earlier. So if we look at this ventral cross section of the brain, remember we take the brain, we literally flip it over. This is going to be the right, this is going to be the left. Here's the circle of Willis right here. So again, I have pictures to show, like, more pictures just so you can visualize it, because I really think visualizing where this is was like the hardest thing for me to grasp during first year. I was like, I just don't get where this is. It's just on the underside of the brain. And when we talk about like brainstem strokes and other types of like brains, like strokes that aren't cerebral strokes, we're going to be talking about other parts of this like blood supply, like these arteries down here, but these are not a part of the circle of Willis. The circle of Willis is strictly this circle with these three, the ACA, the MCA, and the PCA kind of like involved with it. Yes, it is an alien. I'm so glad that you guys see it. Yes, it's an alien and there's an antenna up here. Yes, so that's good. The alien's head, that's your circle of Willis, okay? And then the antenna is going to be your ACA, and then whatever these are your MCAs, and then your PCAs are going to be like the, where the arms are coming off of this alien. All right. But again, like I showed you, people tend to get this confused because they're like, oh, is this the circle down here? And I'm like, no, the circle's really tiny. It's just like, it's right up here. And it just does like the cerebrum. These other arteries are going to be very, very important for like brainstem strokes and stuff like that. But I have another picture to show you later. But kind of like how I best thought to do this was, like I said, kind of show you what symptoms you would see in a stroke. And then you can kind of figure out like what things these arteries do. So for example, like the ACA, the anterior cerebral artery, this supplies the frontal lobe and the the frontal and prefrontal motor cortex. So already thinking, okay, motor, like a lot of motor symptoms, as well as parts of the primary motor and primary sensory cortex. What's weird about the ACA is notice how it kind of like goes past that central sulcus. And it kind of covers, like, here's your central sulcus. It does both like motor and it does some sensory stuff. So but it also does like frontal lobe. So it's like, it's hard because these arteries don't all supply like a nice lobe. Like it's in in a nice little box. It's not like, oh, the ACA supplies the frontal lobe. The ACA supplies part of the frontal lobe and part of the parietal lobe. You know what I mean? It's kind of weird. It's like weird how these things do. So I think like just color coding is really helpful to like learn at least these three main arteries. Is the blood supply above the pia mater? Yes, good question. So this is within now those meningeal, like those matters, the dura, arachnoid, and pia. We're underneath the skull. We're we're basically underneath the pia mater. The pia mater is actually like, it is like basically connected to the brain. Like it technically is connected to it, but yeah, it's like, if not under it, it's right where it is, if that helps. Because like even in this picture, like I can't tell if pia mater's on this or off this because it's like that connected to the brain. Okay. All right. And then the MCA, the MCA does like everything. So for example, it does the lateral areas of the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the parietal lobe. So you can see like the MCA does pretty much everything. So you can imagine with an MCA stroke, you're going to see a lot of symptoms. And then the PCA, I know it says it does a lot of stuff, but the main thing you're going to see with a PCA stroke is going to be like sight issues because you're taking out basically the entire occipital lobe. So you're going to have a lot of problems with vision. There are some other things that it does, which I'll show you, like hippocampus can get affected, which is like emotions, memory. It's part of that limbic system, and then whatever. But other important things is this is contralateral. So for example, the right ACA is going to supply the left side of the body. So just don't forget about that contralateral aspect of the cerebrum. Here's another picture. So here is kind of showing just like, for example, Broca's area and Wernicke's area are both supplied by the MCA. There's other parts like the angular gyrus. Dr. White goes into like all of these. I think if you guys are following still, at least what he did when I watched all of his stuff, he has an entire lecture on just the cerebrum, like all the weird areas of the cerebrum. And that's what he does. He goes into like these really weird areas. But another thing, what I really wanted to do with this slide was to show you like, yeah, this is going to be the left side. We're looking at the left hemisphere. This is the right hemisphere. The brain is not, it's not, what's that word? Symmetric. So for example, Broca's and Wernicke's are on the left hemisphere. Broca and Wernicke's are not on the right hemisphere. So let's say you have a right stroke of the MCA, you're not like a right-sided MCA stroke, you're not affecting Broca's, you're not affecting Wernicke's. You're going to get some weird symptoms that are similar because it's like, I think Broca's area on the left, there's like a similar area on the right that affects how like you intonate your voice. Is that the right word? I don't even know if that's the right word. But you know, like not intonate. I don't think that's a word. Like how much like emphasis you put on words. Like you would speak very monotone, for example, if you took out like what is on the right side where Broca's area is. So like if it's not called Broca's area, but if you took out what would be Broca's area on the right side, it's like you can't put in inflections. That's what I was thinking. You can't put like inflections on your words. So it's like, it's weird. Usually they stick to like, you know, left side because that's what everyone learns. But there are some weird right-sided symptoms that Dr. White does go into. I did not go into it because I think that's really like fine tuning. I think it's really important just like to do like what's like the most important thing to get out of like, what's the most common thing I'm going to see with like an ACA stroke, an MCA stroke, and a PCA stroke. But I just want you to know, like, there are some weird things because the brain is not symmetric. There are these other weird areas. Like, there's the left side and the right side are different. Similar, but different. Okay. Here's another picture. This is from Amboss, again, showing you circle of Willis. Here's your ACA up here, your MCA here, and then your PCA here. And just don't forget, like, because again, people are always tempted to be like, oh, like this is ACA, this is MCA, and like this is PCA. Like they think this whole thing is the circle of Willis. And remember, it's not. Remember, the circle is just the alien's head. Okay. And again, here's like another kind of visual of like the circle of Willis instead of just looking at it from like a ventral aspect. Again, it would be more so like up here. And again, it's not actually a circle, but it looks like a circle if you're looking at it from it head on. And then these other aspects supply like parts of the brainstem and whatnot. Okay. Yeah. And again, we're going to go into all these other beautiful arteries when we talk about the brainstem blood supply. Okay. Cortical strokes. So a stroke of basically the ACA, MCA, or PCA, these are your cortical strokes. These are not brainstem strokes. These are not cerebellar strokes. These are not, you know, other types of strokes. Cortical strokes are going to be like the big strokes. Like when people go to the hospital, I'm having a stroke type of thing. It's usually going to be one of these guys, an ACA, MCA, or PCA stroke. And this is what I'm saying, like a lot of the times on your exam, they're not going to say this patient's having a brainstem stroke. You're going to have to decide like, does this sound like a cortical stroke or does this sound like a brainstem stroke? Because there is overlap. And that's kind of what my idea was here, to teach you the cortical ones first, and then the brainstem ones are going to be afterwards when you can kind of get like a good grasp on the corticals. So my little pro tip is these, again, cortical strokes, these are big. Like brainstem strokes affect like either the midbrain or the pons or the medulla. Like they're very like pinpointy. Cortical strokes, like these are big strokes. Like again, imagine like taking out this entire area of the brain. Like that's going to be a big stroke. Even the ACA, like just huge areas of the brain are getting absolutely taken out by these strokes. So I usually tell people when you see an entire part of the body being taken out, so like an entire part, like the entirety of the upper extremity or the entirety of the lower extremity, plus some sort of aphasia, so like Broca's aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia, which I'll talk about very briefly, that's usually a cortical stroke. Like I said, there's some overlap. And this is where like doing questions is so important with neuro, because it's like you kind of you're going to start doing questions. You're going to be like, this just sounds like a cortical stroke. Like this just sounds like much bigger symptom. Like this just sounds like one. And you'll only get to that point when you're doing questions over and over again, like on cortical strokes versus brainstem strokes and stuff. And we'll even before your exam, I can even bring in just a bunch of questions and just grill you guys with questions on like the different, and you have to figure out what type of stroke it is. But you'll pick up on this pretty quickly. But at least for today, what I wanted to do was, yes, this is like, okay, remember on that one slide I had, okay, it affects the frontal and prefrontal motor cortexes, the primary motor cortex, primary sensory cortex. How's that going to look on a stroke? So if I'm taking out the frontal and prefrontal motor cortexes, like I take out I completely lose blood supply of my ACA, I'm going to lose primitive reflexes. So I'm going to have like a positive Babinski sign. So Babinski sign is basically like, remember when you take like a pen or like you take like your reflex hammer and you rub the bottom of a patient's foot, which you do this eventually with your SPs, don't worry. You will have to rub the bottom of the patient's foot, and usually the toes are supposed to curl in, If they're having like, if you lose primitive reflexes, usually Babinski, the toes fan out. So when you do that, they'll fan out. That's Babinski's. There's other primitive reflexes that you can test for, like in, in your PBL sessions. But that's always a main indication. Like, yes, this is an AC, like a frontal. I took out my frontal cortex, like my frontal lobe, basically. I have my primitive reflexes are gone. May or may not be present. Altered mental status, some sort of aphasia, like I said, urinary incontinence. I'm going to go on a limb and say if you see urinary incontinence, besides normal pressure hydrocephalus, usually they're talking about an ACA stroke. And again, it has to go back to the homunculus, because remember with the homunculus, which I'll go back to very, very briefly, it's like the genitals are down here where, like, because the ACA area is going to be like here. Because remember, the ACA does like this part, and then the MCA is going to be more around here, and then the PCA is going to be like where the eyes are, which doesn't really help with the homunculus, but that's kind of like ACA, think of like this area, versus MCA is going to be more like this, like around here. Because again, the MCA does such a huge area of the brain. Okay, so urinary incontinence. So the genitals are affected. You can have urinary incontinence with ACA strokes. You're going to see contralateral muscle weakness, and the lower extremity gets affected way more than the upper extremity. And then your primary sensory cortex affection is going to be the contralateral loss of sensation. And again, lower extremity is affected way more than upper extremity. And I have here, like, I didn't even want to put like upper extremity could be affected, but like it can sometimes if they're trying to be tricky. But lower extremity is affected a lot more in ACA strokes than any other part of the body. And again, it's because of the homunculus. Okay. So I have this. This is more so for you guys to do later. It's kind of like go through it and be like, okay, like this is how an ACA stroke will present. So I'm telling you, this is an ACA stroke. So now it's like, okay, is this a left side or a right side? Hopefully you can be like, okay, well, the weakness of the left leg, that's got to be a right side stroke. Then you keep going. So we have lower extremity weakness. He's got urinary incontinence, blah, 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 blah. Muscle strength is 2 out of 5. So muscle, like motor function is gone. Sensation is decreased. Plantar reflex shows an extensor response on the left. This is Babinski's. This is them saying positive Babinski's. They'll never say patient has positive Babinski. They'll say this. So on mental status, he is oriented to person, place, and time. Like I said, you don't always see like altered mental status. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And then all the different types of aphasias here. So this is your classic ACA stroke. Oh, I forgot I underlined stuff. And then I underlined everything that's really like should be like screaming like this is an ACA stroke. And it is on the right because again, the left side is affected in like almost all of these things. And remember, it's always contralateral. Okay. And then here's like a picture of it. So we have a left-sided ACA stroke. We're going to see right-sided symptoms, but again, your lower extremity is affected way more than upper extremity. Not saying your upper extremity can't get affected, but if it's you're always going to have lower extremity, and then you might sometimes have upper extremity in addition. You'll never have like upper without lower with an ACA stroke, again, because of the homunculus. And then, of course, the urinary incontinence. Okay, so MCA does like everything. So it does the temporal lobe, parietal lobe, and the frontal lobe. Oops. So you're going to see either Broca's aphasia or Wernicke's aphasia if left-sided. So remember, Broca's and Wernicke's are only on the left hemisphere. So if this is a left MCA stroke, you'll 100% see either Broca's or Wernicke's aphasia. Right-sided, you'll see hemi-neglect. So hemi-neglect is, again, I think Dr. White goes into it, but it's like when you completely ignore one half of your body. So it's like girls in the morning, they're putting on makeup, they only put makeup on half their face. Like stuff like that. Like they neglect an entire half of their body. The brain's wild, I'm telling you. They knock into like everything on the left side because they just don't see it. They're like, oh, it's not there. Like I don't have half of my body. So if it's a right-sided stroke, usually you'll see hemi-neglect. And then again, contralateral facial symptoms, motor and sensory, upper extremity symptoms, motor and sensory, and then lower extremity symptoms, motor and sensory. But since we're MCA, think about the homunculus, the upper extremity in the face is going to be a lot more affected than the lower extremity. Again, not saying it can't get affected, but usually it's going to be the upper extremity in the face are going to be the main like problems with MCA strokes. And then I have here, there are branches of the MCA called lenticulostriate vessels. These are going to supply the basal ganglia and the internal capsule. I ended up putting slides on that in here, but I think I'm going to do it later because it is complex. Like the symptoms are super complex. I think I want to save it for and just another day because it's just like your head's yeah, it's just like a thing. But so it's kind of like your MCA, that's the main artery. That's like the arms, you know, your little no, that's like the eyes in your little alien guy in the circle of Willis. And then it has these little tiny branches that come off of it as well, called lenticular striate vessels. And I'll still show you a picture of them, but we're not going to go into them in too much detail because again, like at least today, because they're complicated. I did put them in here, but they're complicated. Oh yeah. And then yeah. So I also put in here I forgot I put this in here. Gertzmann syndrome. So Gertzmann syndrome, it's a triad, and it's when you have a left MCA stroke that affects something called the left angular gyrus of the parietal lobe. And the left angular gyrus is like just one of those things that's a location. I have a picture on the next slide. But again, the MCA affects it does supply the left part of the parietal lobe. And you have a triad. You have the patient can't read, they can't conduct simple math, and they can't recognize their own fingers. It's really weird. I had a question about Gertzmann's on boards, and I'm like, what? It's like, why are you asking me this? But it was literally like, what is that? Like, what is that? And it was a left MCA stroke. But so the patient, it's called alexia, so inability to read, acalcula, inability to conduct simple math, and then finger agnosia. So you see your fingers and you think that these are like someone else's fingers, I guess. It's so bizarre, but it's like you look at your own fingers, you're like, those aren't my fingers. It's someone else's fingers. That's Gertzmann's. And I wanted to just show you where like the left angular gyrus is, which is right there. Yeah, a lot of these things sound made up. I can't wait till you guys learn about some other symptoms. Gertzmann's, though, I will say, is usually the only thing you see. Meaning, like, if you have Gertzmann syndrome, you're not going to have any of these other things with MCA strokes, if that makes sense. It's like a very particular portion of the left parietal lobe got affected, and that led to Gertzmann syndrome. So it doesn't present as a normal MCA stroke. Honestly, I don't know why I put this in here. I think I just wanted to talk about something, like, make you guys think I was lying about something. But no, seriously, like, there's some really odd things that you're going to learn. Just like when little parts of the brain get affected, you're like, that's not real. That can't be real. There's another part. No, we're not going to talk about it. There's some really cool stuff with neuro. But yeah, so that is, again, specifically this area of the MCA gets blocked. That's Gertzmann syndrome versus like all of this can get affected. So just as an example that this is not like foolproof for everything. Like, again, Gertzmann's is a very niche part of this, just like there's other syndromes that are very niche parts of other types of strokes that you can see. But today I'm gonna be focusing on like the big guys, like a classic MCA stroke, just like I did a classic ACA stroke is this. Like, this is exactly what an ACA stroke is gonna sound like. So same with an MCA stroke, it would sound like this. So immediately, this is an MCA stroke. Difficulty speaking, I'm already thinking mouth. I'm already thinking, okay, he's older. Usually when they're trying to get at, like, it's a stroke of some sort, they're going to talk about, like, symptoms of, like, risk factors for stroke. So, like, high blood pressure, hypertension. No, that's the same thing. Like, high lipid levels, things like that. Type 2 diabetes. Like, they'll talk about that usually in the vignette to kind of help you be like, oh, they're probably talking, like, this person probably had a stroke. Okay, so, and they're usually older. So 78-year-old, difficulty speaking, abruptly, usually they are abrupt. So he wasn't doing anything. He has all the risk factors for a stroke, blah, blah, blah. So he's right-handed. Patient speaks in short, simple sentences and has difficulty repeating sequences of words. This is Broca's aphasia, which I have a slide on later. And then there's facial droop. This is a cranial nerve symptom, which don't worry about it now. And then muscle strength is 4 out of 5 on the right and 5 out of 5 on the left. Mild right-sided pronator drift. Pronator drift, this is another side of, like, it's not really a, what's the term? It's not really one of those primitive reflexes, but it is a way to test for strokes, is you do pronator drift, which is kind of like you have the patient like extend their arms like this, and you try to push it down, and they're not supposed to be able to, if they're having a stroke, they're just going to keep going down. Like, they are going to it's going to pronate down, if that makes sense. But if I were like, don't let me push your arms down, like, you're not going to let me push your arms down, and then it's fine. So that's pronator drift. So this is your MCA stroke. And again, this is usually the left side. Well, this is the left side because, again, like I said, this is Broca's aphasia, right? So that's only going to be on the left side. But it also says, like, on the muscle strength on the right is affected. So again, that's another indication, like, okay, this is a left-sided MCA stroke. Okay. And then this, and then it's showing here, this is showing Broca's, so difficulty speaking, like they just can't get out words and they're stuttering and they're just like not able to. You can also see Wernicke's, you can also see different types of aphasias. Anything can pretty much get affected with your left-sided MCA strokes. But again, if you have a left-sided stroke, the right side is going to be affected and you're going to have upper extremity symptoms as well as some lower extremity, but not as bad, but especially the face. So it's especially the face and the upper extremity. That's why these are darker. But you can also see like some torso. It's just, you can see everything because again, MCA does like everything. I don't think I want to do, I'll save this for like another day, all the aphasias, because I don't want to rush through the actual stroke stuff, because I think that's the most important. But these are a few slides on like the different types of aphasias. So again, like I said, I'll do this really quick because these are the two most important ones. But Broca's, another name for Broca's is non-fluent, because again, they're speaking like this. They're like not able to speak. So it's like they're just saying, not like they are just like, they can't say words. So they're stuttering, broken words. This is a motor problem. We're in like the motor, like we're near, at least near the motor cortex. That's how you can kind of remember it. It's still in the frontal lobe, but it's like near, the primary motor cortex. And then speech is slow and broken. And so it's like people remember like Broca's, bad MF. I'm not going to say it, but Broca, motor, frontal. Versus Wernicke's, this is another name for Wernicke's aphasia, is fluent aphasia, because they can speak fluently and there's nothing wrong with how they're speaking. But this is a sensory issue. It's a problem with comprehension, like hearing. And again, you can remember you're in the temporal lobe, which is where like the auditory cortex is, like where hearing is. So it's like, again, it's not really a problem with hearing, but I just remember it's like, it's near the hearing area of the brain. So it's more of like an input thing, like an actual like sensory problem. So speech is normal, and it's excessive, meaning like they're just talking a lot, but it doesn't make sense. So if you look up on like YouTube, like literally look up like patient with Wernicke's aphasia, it's wild. Like they will sit there and just talk, and like you're like, oh, okay, like okay, it's like talking to a child, and you're just like, oh, like what happened next? But it's like they don't think that they're saying anything wrong. They think that they're totally fine. So people remember like Wernicke's, this is like they're saying wacky words or like a word salad. I like word salad because it's like they're just saying any word. Like it's like someone just learned how to like speak and they're just saying every word that they've ever learned. And then just wanted to point, oh yeah, I do like this picture. It's a little blurry, it's from first aid, but it's basically showing it color coded where the homunculus lines up with the ACA and the MCA. And yes, the PCA is on here, but remember the PCA isn't really affected with the homunculus. The PCA more so is like vision and sight. And like you'll see vision problems with PCA. I'll show you what it's kind of going to look like. But the ACA, again, is going to be more lower extremity. And then the MCA is going to be way more upper extremity and like face and stuff, because it just lines up with the homunculus. Aphasias, like I said, we're going to skip this. There's not many slides on it, but again, I don't want to really rush. There are a bunch of different types. Aphasias are kind of confusing, I'm not going to lie. You think that they're pretty, you're like, oh, they're not bad, but it's kind of like, when they bring in like problems like repetition versus like, I don't even know, it just kind of gets a little confusing. So we can do these we'll do these another day. There's not many, but we'll do them another day. And then your PCA, this is again, it looks like there's a lot of stuff with PCA, but the main thing is going to be except like vision stuff. And what the visual problem is not going to make sense right now because you haven't gone through like vision and the pathways of like the pathways of vision. But I will read it to you. You will see contralateral homonymous hemianopsia with macular sparing. This is going to make complete sense later. You're going to be like sounding like a genius. But this is what you will see when you have a PCA stroke. Other things you can see is like contralateral sensory loss. If it's left-sided, you can't comprehend written words, which again is called alexia. So remember from Gertzmann syndrome. But you don't have problems writing. So you don't have agraphia. So they call it like alexia without agraphia. It's weird. It's like those weird parts of the parietal lobe that the PCA can do. But what I usually tell, and then if it's right-sided, you'll see prosopagnosia, which is like you can't recognize familiar faces. So like let's say you're at home and you have a PCA stroke on the right side, a right-sided PCA stroke, then you wake up and you see like your dad, but you're like, I have no idea who that is. Like I've never seen that person before. It's not really amnesia. It's like you know that there's someone, but you don't know who they are. It's really odd. That's prosopagnosia. I don't think I'm saying that right. But this, and I always tell people are like, how am I gonna remember all this? Like this is so I'm like, you will never see a PCA stroke though without these visual symptoms. And if you know, and you'll learn the like what homonymous hemianopsia with macular sparing means. When you see that described in a vignette, you're like, this is a PCA stroke. Like you don't even have to like worry about anything else, honestly. And then the PCA, which we'll talk about when we get into like brainstem, PCA also supplies the midbrain. So you will see, in addition to all of these like cortical symptoms, you also will see like midbrain stroke, like midbrain brainstem stroke symptoms as well, which we're not doing today. But you will also see those because the PCA supplies the brainstem. So this is your classic PCA stroke. So again, it's gonna, like I said, it's gonna be a everything. It's gonna be like a hodgepodge of everything. But if I'm looking for like that visual thing, it's right here. This is basically like what it's describing. Contralateral homonymous hemianopsia with macular sparing. Confrontation test shows loss of the nasal field in the left eye, temporal field in the right eye with macular sparing. That's what this will be in your vignette for a PCA stroke. And then it's other things too. It's like unable to read phrases shown to him. So alexia, but he can write them. So he doesn't have agraphia, little things like that. Numbness of the leg, just like a bunch of stuff basically. But you have the vision symptom. You're like, cool, that's my PCA stroke. And it kind of went into everything I mentioned. Like left side, you're going to see, oh, I guess we didn't do right or left. That's all right. But it's always going to be contralateral. So you can see it here. So the right side's affected, so it's going to be left. This is going to be on the left side. And then again, if it's a left side, you can look for like that alexia without agraphia versus like something like prosopagnosia. Yeah, I swear these are real words. And then again, this is kind of what a left-sided homonymous hemianopsia looks like with macular sparing. Should be right-sided. So this is right-sided homonymous hemianopsia with macular sparing. We'll do a whole thing on it. I love vision stuff. It's very fun. But you'll see right-sided symptoms, again, sensory. That's why, again, I like this picture because it just like, the amboss just crossed off the whole body. They're like, yeah, just everything's affected with a PCA stroke. But you'll always see these vision symptoms. Always, always, always. All right, and then very quickly, these transition zones. So see how we switch from like your ACA to your MCA to your PCA? What's that called? We're back at watersheds. Yes, amazing. TBT. So watersheds. These are exactly like watersheds from GI block. Exactly. So it's kind of like you get a switch in blood supply from one to the other. These are the areas that are going to be really, really, really susceptible to, if you suddenly lose blood, these are the areas that are going to be very susceptible to ischemia because, again, you get a switch in blood supply. Exactly the same as GI. If you have like really good notes on watersheds from GI, go back and read them and remind yourself of them and be like, oh, okay, cool. Like those are your classic watershed zones. There's two, and they're in this image here. So there's ACA, MCA, and then there's MCA, PCA. Sometimes people ask about like what about, here, like these border zones here. And it's like, if you see border zone, it's like, it's the same thing. That's a watershed zone. But I call them watershed zones. I think it's just because they're the same as GI. So it's like if you, again, just kind of pull your knowledge from GI. So a watershed infarct, again, it's going to be like an infarct of the watershed zone. And it's the exact same reason why in GI you get a watershed infarct. You suddenly lose blood pressure and it drops really, really, really rapidly to the point where the first areas affected are going to be the first areas that you have a switch in blood supply. So if we read this very long thing that I somehow, for some reason, wrote, drop in blood pressure or occlusion, yes, you can have ischemia. In the vessel prior to entering the circle of Willis, you have a rapid drop in cerebral perfusion. ACA, MCA, PCA, not perfused as well. Body tries to compensate, but watershed zones are most susceptible to infarcting due to the switch in blood supply, exactly like in the colon. So you can see here's going to, and again, they're called border zones here, but they're the same thing. And it's just everywhere where you get a switch in blood supply. So you have ACA, MCA, and you have MCA, PCA. There's 4 total. Yes, good question. So yes, actually, these are both same question came up. Awesome. Yeah, so you would see 4 in total. Exactly. I think they're just trying to show it so you can kind of like compare. But yeah, you would always get like them on both sides. And that's really important because of the symptoms that you'll see, which we'll go over. But so for example, right here is an MCA. I started with the MCA PCA watershed because this is like not as common as an ACA MCA. You'll have problems with visual processing. I don't think you'll get a question about this one because it's just like not super common. They technically are on both sides, but the arrows are just pointing at one hemisphere. but you will see them on both sides. This is the more common one. This is going to be your ACA-MCA watershed infarct. If you have an ACA-MCA watershed zone infarct, that's called man in a barrel syndrome, which is just fun. So man in a barrel. So I tried my best to find a picture of, so I tried my best to find a picture of a man in a barrel, which, yes, this is a man in a barrel, but it's not correct. So imagine this guy's arms were inside of the barrel. Okay, that's man in a barrel syndrome. So man in a barrel syndrome is you basically lose motor function, sometimes sensory, but again, because it's like ACA, MCA, remember that's the part of like the homunculus. Like if we go back, actually, sorry, don't hit me. Oh, good. So if we go back to like the motor and sensory homunculi, yeah, technically this is like the area that we're affected. And you're like, okay, well, why wouldn't we have as many sensory issues? It's kind of like the motor of like the extremities are like more, like they kind of have more rank, I guess, than like the sensory aspects of like the homunculus when it comes to like the extremities. The face sensory is also really, really big. You can see the face is drawn really large and like excessively large. But for whatever reason, when you have like something like this where like both homunculi would get affected, motor usually trumps. And it's just something like, it's just something that I think it's just because it's like they just trump for whatever reason because of the homunculus. But you can see sensory symptoms, but I'm telling you, like, you'll see motor symptoms. And like man in a barrel syndrome is usually just motor, but not saying you can't see sensory. Just wanted to put that out there. But usually, again, since we're ACA, MCA, so we're closer to like that top part of like the homunculus, the symptoms are only going to be upper extremity on both sides. Okay. So what it kind of means is like, again, this guy's arms are inside this barrel. So then imagine only what's in the barrel can't move. So it's just like these parts of the arm that's like, and like the whole just extremity, everything that's in the barrel, anything touching the barrel can't move. Everything else is fine. Okay? That's man in a barrel. It's really weird. But that's your ACA, MCA watershed infarct. It's man in a barrel syndrome. And I think I tried to find a vignette on it. I just couldn't find one, but it'll come up sometimes maybe. But like that's how they'll describe it. All right, so that's man in a barrel. Here's a summary just for your, like perusing later. So brain side blood supply, I think I have like one slide on this. We're doing an entire session on this. We're going to have my whole foolproof way of never getting a brainstem stroke question wrong. But I wanted to point out, we're back at that circle of Willis thing, right? So here's your circle of Willis. But now we're like here. We're at like we're here down. That's what supplies the brainstem. But I highlighted the PCA because notice the PCA now is supplying the cerebrum and it's supplying the brainstem. So PCA is not great to kind of like affect because you're taking out like your whole like CNS, PNS, like you're taking out everything. Here are the 5 arteries. I just listed them here. We're going to do them later. Certain ones supply, midbrain versus pons versus medulla. Certain ones supply medial parts of the brainstem versus lateral parts, which again, we'll do later. But yeah, we're not going into too much detail. And then I'm going to go to the cerebellum next. It's again, back to this picture because everything comes from this picture. There's 3 main arteries that supply the cerebellum and they all have cerebellar in the name, which is really nice. But if they're abbreviated, they don't. So just keep that in mind. So the first one is your superior cerebellar. Your second one is your anterior inferior cerebellar artery. And your last one's your posterior inferior cerebellar artery. As you can imagine, by the overlap in blood supply, brainstem lesions can also lead to cerebellar symptoms. So remember, cerebellar symptoms are things like you're having difficulty like staying on your feet. You're having like those ataxia symptoms. All right, and then the deep structures. This is what I said I'm going to skip. I'm not going to go into because it's just there's not enough time. And I didn't want to rush. This is confusing. I didn't want to rush it. I was very hopeful that I wouldn't nerd out about the brain. It's just so cool. But anyway, so this is your MCA. So remember I said like the MCA, I don't think you can see it in the circle of Willis picture, but like, so here's your MCA. See these little tiny baby vessels coming off the MCA? That's what I'm talking about. So they don't really do stuff with like the cerebrum. Those guys kind of go into like the deeper structures. So those things we talked about earlier, like the basal ganglia, the internal capsule, things like that. Those are called your lenticulostriate arteries. And I put here, like, you can kind of see these symptoms in an MCA stroke, sometimes in an ACA, because there are like you can't see them in here, but like very deep in here, they can supply like these deep structures. But usually you'll see them with like your MCA strokes. And again, we're going to go through these later. This is like, we're doing this later, just all sorts of stuff. But like, if you see here, like it'll say like MCA, so your middle cerebral artery, the lenticular striate arteries supply deeper structures of the brain, so your putamen, globus pallidus, all those things we talked about. And then it talks about, some of the things that you would see with like features of ischemia and hemorrhage. Some of them are like, what the heck is that? And it's probably something coming from like these deeper structures being affected as well. So it's like something that can be in an MCA stroke, like a vignette about it, but it's not going to be like the main thing. And then here's again, the lenticular striate. When you have a stroke of, let's say you have a stroke of just the lenticular striate, so like just these. Oh, perfect. This is the question coming in. So let's say you have a stroke of just these. So like we're going here. So we don't have an MCA stroke. We just have a stroke here. And you're like, how the heck does that happen? Like that doesn't happen. That happens if you have hypertension for like ever. Like you've had uncontrolled hypertension like your entire life. What happens is, since these, it's kind of like watersheds a little bit, where it's kind of like, these are like these tiny little vessels that get blood. But let's say now you have such high blood pressure. Just imagine like all this blood rushing through like these baby tiny little delicate vessels. It can just like ruin these vessels. It can just like completely just take them out. When that happens, so again, when that happens, when you have like a stroke of the little vessels, but not like the main guys, those are called lacunar strokes. Okay, so one of the most common lacunar strokes, obviously, is going to be what I just kind of talked about. It's going to be of, the lenticular striate vessels or something like that. So like we're affecting like the internal capsule, and we're affecting the basal ganglion and whatnot. But we're not going into this today. But that's what lacunar strokes are. We will talk about it at some point. But they're really, like I said, they're really weird symptoms. And the reason they are called lacunar strokes, just to, hopefully it'll help maybe someone remember this, when whoever named these, actually I'm going to go back to my little picture here. Whoever named these, when they were trying to when they looked at like a brain cross-section after I guess someone had a lacunar stroke, they found in like, let's say like this caudate nucleus area, when so we're taking these out, right? So we're losing blood supply. They would get little mini infarctions that look like little circles, like this. And lacuna are basically little lakes. That's what like a lacuna is. It's a little lake. So whoever, again, named this was saying like, oh, like we have these tiny little infarctions that are coming like in these areas, coming from these tiny vessels becoming like basically taken out. So it's saying that they look like little lakes. And that's like where lacunar strokes, that's like what the name lacunar strokes comes from. So again, it's not just the lenticular striate arteries that cause lacunar strokes, but that's like the most common one you're going to see. So we're going to go into this one a lot, but there are different types. When we do like the diencephalon too, and like the thalamus, there's also like the thalamus gets affected all on its own, and that's like its own type of stroke. Those are like tinier strokes. They're called lacunar strokes. Okay. I think that's it. Yes. Okay. So, sorry I didn't do everything. I got a little ambitious, but I hope that was helpful for day 1 of neuro. How do I stop this? Oh, good. Okay. But, okay. If you guys have any questions, you can email me. I'll upload this. And just do the questions. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll schedule a round 2. We'll do brain. I'm telling you, I have a foolproof way. No one has ever gotten brainstem strokes wrong with my little, I call it the tic-tac-toe method. And I've taught like every single year below me in med school this method. So like everyone's doing this method. You guys are welcome. So we'll do that, and have a great night. Bye.